Hello everyone. Yes, we're doing a 3-tone camouflage. Of course, not without the usual drama. Also, I applied way too much masking tape, created the weirdest contraptions and ruined the base coat. Yes, again. And if that wasn't enough, I ran out of paint. So get ready, because we have a lot of work ahead of us. Before I could start painting, some preparations were in order. I thoroughly cleaned the whole model in soapy water to remove all dust, grease and other unwanted leftovers from the build. Call me crazy, but I always enjoy this part. Somehow, things always look less like a horror show after you clean your model. Although spilling super glue like a bartender after a happy hour isn't something to be proud of, so I had to carefully sand the surface smooth. To hold the model while painting, I made this contraption where I taped a bottle upside down on the hall floor. Weirdly enough, the bottle cap fitted perfectly into the turret opening, and I was still able to install the turret without any problems. It turns out that skipping the whole floor in the previous episode had its benefits after all. Lucky me. And before I knew it, I was reliving old episodes of Airwolf. I mean, look at this thing. Moving on. Lastly, I painted all the metal surfaces with a metal primer and let it dry overnight. And even though I made sure that all the parts were covered by the primer, I still had some problems with it. But more on that later. Now that everything is prepped, we can finally start painting. Yes, I made the joke twice, but let's get down to business. Since I'm painting a 3-color scheme and didn't want to oversaturate the colors too much, I chose a neutral grey primer. And yes, there it is. The sponge still hadn't left the workbench. And no, this is not staged. It's pure chaos at my workbench, especially while I'm airbrushing. I grab whatever I get my hands on. In any case, I've come to appreciate this stage of the model's transformation. Honestly, back in the day I really wasn't all that into painting, but lately, since I'm spending more hours at the bench, this is beginning to change. It is really satisfying and enjoyable seeing all your hard work come to life in this beautiful unified tone. Since the turret was now smooth and clean again, spraying on the primer was a breeze. And surely enough, the thing looked even more like a medieval knight. Next up was the suspension. I was already beginning to regret that I made everything workable, but priming them still went without too many problems. Although, securing them to the cardboard with sticky tape wasn't the best solution. Now that priming was done, we could finally move on to the base coat. The colors suggested in this kit are no longer available, so I had to mix my own. I still find it difficult to predict the final result after weathering, so I at least try to match the colors in the manual to the best of my ability. For the base coat, I set it on Danko Gelb and lightened it with a lighter version of the same color. With the Semovente failure still fresh in my mind, I started spraying multiple light coats, making sure each coat went on wet. Spraying acrylics turns out to be a bit more challenging than I thought and takes a bit of practice. Many of you already know this, but if it looks wet, you're good. Just make sure not to flood the surface. I also learned that spraying at a slight angle helps prevent overspray, which could lead to a rough surface, which is something we absolutely don't want. During longer sessions, I tend to spray a bit of thinner through the airbrush to make sure everything keeps running smoothly. It felt good getting the paint on, and to my surprise, a lot of the errors I made during the build were toned down quite a bit. That was a nice confidence boost, and I almost forgot about the huge mistake I made earlier in the build. But that confidence would be destroyed very soon, only I didn't know it at the time. Next was the suspension, and since the cardboard didn't work out, I attached them to mixing cups. This worked a bit better, and at least now I was able to rotate them more easily. Still, spraying the movable wheels and bogies proved to be quite a challenge, and I am not even sure whether I'll make use of their mobility in the end. Lastly, I sprayed the turret and managed to get the base coat on without any major problems. So far so good. It turned out a bit too greyish for my taste, but I was still happy with the result. With the base coat out of the way, it was time for the first camouflage color. Of course I forgot to mask the suspension attachment points and was unable to fit the suspension after spraying. So I had to scrape the paint off to make sure everything would fit again. With that out of the way, we could finally start masking. This is my first hard-edged 3-tone camouflage, so I first tested different methods. Liquid mask damaged the paint and produced jagged edges, and doing it all by brush was a bit too adventurous for me. Yet camouflage putty provided exactly the result I was looking for. I have never used this stuff before, but man, this is the weirdest putty ever. I started rolling small sausages of it and applied them roughly on the surface. Then I used different silicone brushes to shape them into the pattern I was trying to replicate. But this turned out to be quite tedious. The masking putty is super sticky and gets everywhere if you're not careful. It is also very hard to cut or rip off. And yes, Cutting it with a metal nipper is absolutely not the correct way of doing things, but if you watch this channel regularly, you are probably not surprised either. Moving on to the hull, I applied longer strips, making sure to follow the instructions provided in the color profile. Although it was very tedious, it worked better than I expected, and the sculpting tools proved to be very helpful here. I was well on my way when I discovered even more weird properties of this stuff. It tends to fall under its own weight, and if that isn't enough, before you know it, it sticks to other parts of the putty, making them come loose if you're not careful. So I had to constantly redo different sections and make sure none of them got stuck while working on the pattern. In the end, I was able to finish it, but when I returned next morning to the bench, I was in for a real surprise. The whole thing looked like a melted Judge Doom. The whole pattern was destroyed. Of course I didn't read the instructions, and it turned out this stuff deteriorates after a while. Because of this setback, I had to rework most of it before I could finally move on to painting. Never a dull moment at the Sprue Tactical workbench. I lightened Nathan Green with a light green Arial tone, and was more than ready to get the paint on. To make sure I didn't have too much overspray, I masked the surrounding areas with tape while painting. At the time, I felt it would be best to mask and spray each section separately, but this made it a bit cumbersome, since I had to constantly pause spraying and refit all of the mask before I could move on to the next section. As the painting progressed, the whole thing kept looking more ridiculous by the minute. I mean, look at this, chaos as usual. Don't use this as a tutorial, I am sure there are better ways to do it. Anyway, the running gear was a bit simpler, and I even skipped a few spots since they would be easier to paint later with a brush. After making sure everything was sprayed from different angles, it was time to remove the masking putty. Despite the silly look of the excessive amount of tape, it was extremely satisfying to reveal the camouflage. I just could not get enough of it. There was a bit of overspray on the turret, and some of the edges could have been a bit cleaner, but nothing we can fix later on. For now, I was quite pleased with how it turned out, and I was ready for the second color. So, back to the rolling again. This time I cut the putty with a razor blade, which made things a bit easier. Since the camouflage is repeated on the running gear, I had to constantly check and make sure the pattern matched fluidly on both sections of the tank. Because the putty stays workable forever, it was quite easy to go back and forth and adjust it with the silicone pencils. Now that I have learned that the putty will deteriorate over time, I figured it would be best to split the masking and painting of the hull into multiple sessions. So I taped the whole thing up again and started painting. I don't want to know how much tape I wasted during the whole project. For the brown, I used a brown Arial color. I'll put a list of the paints in the description if you're interested. Although a bit too reddish, it matched the color profile close enough for my needs. After making sure I hit the surface from multiple angles, it was time for another camouflage reveal. Still extremely satisfying, but unfortunately I had more overspray. I guess using a massive amount of masking tape doesn't necessarily make you a good masker. The putty started to behave even weirder, which could only mean that I had to wrap things up. But now that I have had a bit of practice, it went much easier. I made smaller sausages, and since I like to live on the edge, I cut them directly on the model. Something I would not recommend doing on your own builds. Anyway, most of the remaining work involved the suspension. Luckily I didn't glue the frame of the return rollers, so applying the putty went a bit smoother. The front pattern looked difficult to replicate, but after inspecting the manual I was able to do that as well. The last challenge was the trench tail, which was fully assembled and already glued to the model because of the chain fittings. Somehow I was able to push a small putty sausage through the support frame and continue the camouflage pattern on the inside. Sometimes I surprise myself, but I'll have to see if this actually works out when airbrushing. Since I was running out of masking tape, I salvaged some aluminium foil from the kitchen. Yes, now that I am done plundering my girlfriend's cosmetic stash, I've moved on to other parts of the house. Also, this time the spraying was less smooth and I was getting a bit of tip dry. I guess I didn't properly dilute the paint, I'm still learning. But because the patches on the running gear were small, it went quite quickly. Lastly, I sprayed the final patch on the front of the hull and then focused on the trench tail. I first sprayed the back of the trench tail before moving on to the inside. As expected, spraying this part of the model proved to be more difficult. Still, with a bit of patience, it all worked out. After removing all the masking tape, it was time to put away the airbrush and do the final touch-ups. Surely, this shouldn't be that hard, right? It wasn't much, but I still had some paint left to finish the camouflage with a brush. I first focused on the areas I couldn't reach with the airbrush or had simply missed. After that, I reworked some of the camouflage patterns that were difficult to mask with putty. like here under the observation device on the turret and under the toolbox. Then I tried to sharpen some of the irregularities in the camouflage, but failed miserably on the left hull. Before I knew it, I had placed a brushstroke that was far too thick. I wasn't sure how to fix it, so I just left it, and I decided I'd deal with it later during weathering. The rest of the brushwork involved finishing the running gear. I made sure the camouflage patterns followed the sections of the hull. Since I have saved my paint mixes, matching the colors was easy. After painting the front wheels, I moved on to the suspension system. And that's where things became a bit confusing. On the left suspension frame, it was simple. The green blob on the hull just continued onto the frame. But on the right side, something didn't quite make sense. According to the manual, only the suspension frame was brown. It looked odd to me, but I decided to follow the instructions and move on. Next, I tackled the trench tail. I deliberately avoided using the airbrush for the second color, since that would have required tedious masking with putty along the brown lines, which would probably have failed. Instead, I painted the second color by brush and cleaned up the transitions afterwards. This time I made sure the paint was thin enough, and I actually had a lot of fun figuring out how to maneuver the brush through the whole structure. It took some time, but it worked out and was well worth the effort. Lastly, I painted all the wheels in a very dark brown, and sure enough, I was reliving memories of painting the Semovente running gear. All this workable stuff is nice, but it's a drama to paint. We're almost done. It was time to fix the tiny bits of overspray I had. Easy peasy, right? I really didn't feel like airbrushing that day. I was tired, in a rush, and I was running low on paint. The perfect setup for disaster. To prevent even more overspray, I taped everything up again. And after spraying a few parts, my airbrush clogged and it was hard to see what I was doing. Stubborn as I am, I continued anyway. And before I knew it, I messed the base coat up. Again. After all the hard work, my heart sank. All those hours of masking, sanding and perfecting, gone in a single square. And to make it even worse, I didn't have enough paint to fix it with the airbrush. So I had no other choice to paint everything by hand. Fed up by my mistake and in a moment of rage, I started painting everything by brush. I painted the turret, the driver's hatch and all the other small details that I had missed. Then I forcefully rammed some paint onto the underside and, of course, tried to fix the left side of the hull. This time I made sure the paint was heavily diluted to overcome brush strokes. But with paint running dangerously low, I was forced to thin it until it was almost watery. With great anxiety, I watched the paint dry and prepared myself mentally for the next round of airbrushing. It was time to seal things up and prepare for a gloss coat. I like to say I learned from my mistakes, but in reality I was just postponing another round of airbrushing. So I took my time masking the attachment points of the running gear frame with liquid mask. I also made sure to mask the inserts of the hull, just to make sure everything would fit after varnishing. But even this seemed problematic for me. And since I wasn't planning on making an RC model, I glued the wheels in place to make airbrushing a bit more fun. With that out of the way, we can finally add the decals. I made sure the surface was spotlessly clean and wetted the first decal. I learned from the Semovente drama, and this time I made sure to get the decal ready and let it soak on a kitchen towel. Then I wetted the surface with a setting solution, and sure enough, the application was much smoother. I call that progress. With a moist cotton bud, I removed the remaining setting solution and pressed out the air bubbles. There aren't many decals in this kit, and most of them had to be placed on the turret, but they are extremely tiny and I had to cut them very precisely. The most challenging part was the hatch on the rear of the turret. Here I had to apply 2 separate decals. Filming was almost impossible, but in the end I managed to pull it off. Not perfect, but better than I had expected. Lastly, I applied the decal softener on top to make sure the decals would follow the details on the surface. One thing if you're building this model. The decal film on the hearts that go on the hull is slightly bigger than the photo etch square you have to apply them to. I scraped the excess off after everything had dried, but this is something to look out for. After a final layer of satin varnish and making sure I didn't flop my tiny cute custom chains, it was finally time to wrap things up. I still had to remove the masking liquid and sponges I applied earlier before the satin varnish, and I was already regretting doing such a good job with it, especially on the suspension bars. It might have been a better choice not to mask them at all. Although it took quite some time to remove it, it still worked out and I did not have any problems fitting the suspension to the hull. And with that, my friends, the first coat of paint is on and the vehicle is ready for weathering, but this will be for the next episode. Man, plastic scale modeling is a lot of work, but I'll have to say, this 3-tone camouflage scheme has been growing on me, and masking it was absolutely worth the effort. In the end, I was able to polish away the mistake I made on the hull, but masking a perfect square isn't something to be proud of. I mean, look at this. You just can't make this stuff up. Anyway, in the last episode, I asked you guys for comments, and you absolutely didn't disappoint. So many of you joined the conversation, and I had a lot of fun talking to each and every one of you. I hope I didn't miss anyone, since the YouTube commenting system for creators can be somewhat of a maze. But to me, a glue not setting on certain plastics certainly set off a spark. It seems many of you had similar experiences, and not all brands go together well. Having multiple glues at hand is the way to go. Also, we now learned that the little thingies on the front of the FT17 are in fact footsteps for the driver to get into the vehicle. It's amazing what we can uncover together, so let's keep the conversation going. What's the most embarrassing mistake you've made on a model kit? Let me know in the comments. Let's heal this drama together. If you survived this episode and made it this far, then you might as well subscribe, because this is not over yet. In the next episode, we still have to weather this tiny tank. Lastly, thank you so much for being part of this journey. You guys make this feel very special, and I don't take any of this for granted. So, as you head back to your own models, remember this. If you make a mistake on your model, don't toss it in the garbage just yet. Push on, finish your model instead, and you will be surprised with the results. Thank you so much for watching, and see you all in the next one.